Hi, everybody. Welcome, and thank you so much for coming to this event about state Supreme Court clerkships. I'm Kasha Wolfcott, Senior Counsel at the Brennan Center and Managing Editor of State Court Report, a free resource devoted to discussion of state courts and state constitutions. So, state Supreme Court decisions have an enormous impact on our lives. For example, state Supreme Courts, relying on state law, upheld marriage equality before SCOTUS did. Some state Supreme Courts have held that the death penalty is unconstitutional in their states while it remains legal under the federal constitution. Some state Supreme Courts, multiple state Supreme Courts, have recently found that their constitutions protect abortion rights after Dobbs. The list goes on and on. The point is that each state has its own constitution, and that constitution can and often does go further than the US Constitution in protecting our rights. And state Supreme Courts have the final word in interpreting those constitutions. So that is why one of my biggest career regrets is that I didn't apply for state Supreme Court clerkships. Luckily, you don't have to make the same mistake that I did. Today, you will learn everything that you need to know about applying for state Supreme Court clerkships, what it's like to clerk on a state high court, what clerks do, and more. And you'll hear it directly from sitting state Supreme Court justices. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. Civility is very important to us, and anybody who makes a rude or inappropriate comment in the YouTube chat will be removed from the conversation. Live closed captioning will be provided. Many of the questions that I will ask today were submitted by law students, but our audience can continue to ask questions in the chat, and we will answer many of them in the last 20 minutes of the program. State Court Report is also currently collecting information from chambers across the country about clerkships and clerkship hiring processes. And when that is ready and done, we have it all compiled, we will make it available on our website, and we will notify everybody in the audience. So now on to today's program. We are honored to be joined by four esteemed jurists who each sit on their state's highest court. First, Judge Caitlin Halligan of the New York Court of Appeals. That's New York's highest court. We've had some tech problems with Judge Halligan's system there, so she may be on and off camera, but hopefully you'll be able to hear her. Next, we have Judge Melissa Hart of the Colorado Supreme Court. Justice Goodwin Liu of the Supreme Court of California, and Justice Melissa Long of the Rhode Island Supreme Court. Thank you. And later we'll be joined by Grace Spulak, the Senior Court Management Consultant at the National Center for State Courts, who will speak very briefly about what the center is doing to promote clerkship opportunities in state and local courts. So good afternoon to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to jump right into some scripted questions and let the judges themselves tell you all about their clerkships. So Justice Liu, I'm going to start with you. What is special about clerking on a state Supreme Court? And what should motivate a law student who may have previously focused their search on federal clerkships?
Oh, thank you, Cassie, and thank you to the Brennan Center for hosting this event. It's an honor to be on this program with my colleagues from the various state high courts. It's nice to be with all of you. So when I address the subject, the first thing that I point to is that no matter what you end up doing, students out there, no matter what you end up doing in practice, whether you go into government, a big firm, or just about anything else you do, you're going to encounter a lot of state law. And that's not something that law school education really prepares you for. Most of law school education, apart from the first year common law courses, is federal. And that's, I think, just a certain kind of bias in the curriculum, maybe in part reflective of the kinds of experiences that law professors have had. And I think it's such a disjuncture because when you get into practice, you realize that actually most of the law that exists out in the American, legal system is actually state. That is evident from the caseloads. I think the caseloads of the state courts are one or two magnitudes greater than in the federal system. In California alone, we have on the order of 1,600 state court judges, which is almost twice the size of the federal judiciary. So if you stop to think about that for a moment, it just means that no matter where you end up in your practice life, you're going to encounter a lot of state law. And so an opportunity to clerk on a state court is one chance to get, I think, a head start on that reality of our legal landscape.
Thank you so much. Justice Hart, I'd like to turn to you next. One of the big things that sets a state Supreme Court clerkship apart from other clerkships is that these are courts of last resort. Can you talk a little bit about how that influences a clerk's experience?
Yes. I think it's a really unique opportunity because we're taking cases that we deem to be the most important. So whereas on courts of appeals, whether they're federal courts of appeals or state courts of appeals, people have an appeal as of right. And so that, some cases will be really important and some cases will frankly not be very important. And we're taking cases that we look at and we say, these cases are going to have consequences beyond the specific issue in this case. It's going to have consequences for parties beyond the parties here. And it matters how we decide this issue beyond this case. And I think that that really impacts the how you think about the case, how you think about how you write it, and the just the consequences of it. And really, I also think clerking on a court of appeals would be wonderful, but I have to say, I think clerking on a court of last resort, you have a unique experience of seeing cases that will be specifically consequential.
Thank you. And I know I'm directing the questions to specific justices, but if anybody else wants to jump in with additional thoughts, I want this to feel like a dynamic conversation. So feel free to just, go right ahead, Justice Long.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate having the opportunity to be here. I just would love to give a counterpoint to what Justice Hart just said, and I'm so happy to hear her perspective on that. But I feel like I must say, as the representative from the smallest state in the country, and one of the few, including another New England state, Vermont, we don't actually have intermediate courts of appeal, and so. So yes, so we have sort of a double whammy, I think, in some ways. We really hear cases that are of consequence sort of writ large, but we also hear the cases that are of consequence to the individual litigants every day. Most of our cases are direct appeal, and my clerks tell me, they remind me actually that of the Justice Jackson quote, the first Justice Jackson, who served from 41 to 54, about the fact that we're not final because we're infallible, but we're infallible because we're final. And I think that has a real resonance with the folks who work on a court like mine, where it is, we're hearing maybe a termination of parental rights appeal, or we're hearing something involving an involuntary commitment. It really is very, the gravity of it is very clear, as I'm sure it is for my colleagues as well. But I think that closeness, or that sense of this really matters for these particular people is consequential.
Go ahead, Judge Halligan.
Thank you. As you mentioned, we had some connectivity issues, so I'm trying to do this on my phone, and hopefully you can hear me okay. I just want to pick up on what a couple of folks said, and let me start by saying it's such a pleasure to have the chance to talk about these issues with some of my colleagues on other courts. One of the tremendous upsides I have found, and not something I appreciated before I joined the New York Court of Appeals, is the opportunity to get to know judges on other state high courts who are thinking about some of the same questions. But to Justice Liu's point, I think that our dockets are incredibly interesting and they're important to the lives of a lot of people and a lot of businesses as well. So we hear a wide range of criminal justice issues. Some of them are statutory, but in our court, many of them are questions of state or federal constitutional procedure. Very diverse array of questions. We get common law cases, which are very interesting, and generally, unless there happens to be some lurking case of federal constitutional law, the last word on whatever the issue is, we hear a lot of constitutional law cases as well. And here in New York, and I'm sure this is true in a number of other states, we have a very rich docket of commercial cases with very interesting and sometimes far-reaching questions, for example, of contract law or perhaps personal jurisdiction, range of issues like that. And, I think the additional point that all of us grapple with, even folks that are doing the work both of an intermediate appellate court and a state high court, as Justice Hart said, we're really trying to think about the downstream implications of our writings, because those cases will govern the work of all of the courts in each of our respective states. And so thinking about how a particular sentence might be read or understood, I think is something that I feel like we all probably pay a lot of attention to. And I think for the clerks, it's an opportunity for them to think with a little bit broader lens than maybe you do in your early years of practice outside of a clerkship.
Thank you. That was very helpful. And actually following up on that, Judge Halligan, would you mind describing like a typical day for your clerks?
Sure. So my primary chambers are in New York City, where we are 3 weeks out of 4. We sit in Albany to hear cases. My guess is some of my colleagues travel as well. So we hear cases 1 week a month from September through June. And I would say about 2/3 to 3/4 of our work is thinking through the cases coming up for argument, working through the questions that are going to come before the court, and then drafting opinions. We are primarily, although not exclusively, a discretionary review court. So much like the certiorari process in the Supreme Court, we have applications to hear cases. And I would say about 1/4 of our work is evaluating those applications and making decisions about which ones present questions that we should hear. And so the clerks are involved in all of that process. They also spend a good bit of time talking through issues with clerks in other chambers, which I think they enjoy and I find very helpful. And a lot of it, I think, is the sort of work you would expect. They read a lot of briefs and they read a lot of cases and they write a lot. And I think that's the bread and butter of our work.
Thank you. Justice Hart, is there anything that you think law students might be surprised to learn state Supreme Court clerks do?
Yes, absolutely. I wanted to become a justice, not because of what people think of justices as doing. I mean, I love reading briefs and writing opinions and sitting to hear cases. I love it. But I am very passionate about civil access to justice. And I wanted to become a justice because state Supreme Courts are the administrators of the justice system. And we create the rules that govern the justice system. We decide who can practice law. Colorado last year passed a rule licensing licensed legal practitioners, non-lawyers who can provide legal services similar to nurse practitioners in the medical field. And we currently have more licensed legal practitioners than any state in the country because it took a long time, but we came up with a really good process for doing it. And that was something that I came in passionate about getting done. And my law clerks, I have a law clerk each year. I have a law clerk who's my access to justice law clerk who helps me with access to justice matters. And I think that's one of the reasons that people apply to meet a clerk, because they know that that's my reputation, is that this is something that I care about and that I work on. And I think people would be surprised to know, and I don't know how much this is true in other states, but I would say 35 to 40% of our time is spent in Colorado on this administrative part of the job. I mean, we run the courts. So whether it's, I in addition to access to justice, I'm the liaison to family, the family law system. I have colleagues who are involved in probation, because probation is part of the court system in Colorado, which is different from a lot of states. My colleague Carlos Samor is the liaison to the criminal jury rules. Like, we're doing all of those things in addition to wearing our black robes and sitting on the bench. And I think, and we get our clerks, more or less involved in those things. And I think the clerks love it when they get involved in those things.
Yeah, that is very cool. Thank you for that. And Justices Long and Liu, do you have anything to add about the day-to-day lives of clerks, or anything that might be surprising about what they do?
I'm happy to chime in with a word. So I think what Judge Halligan described is very similar for our court. Clerks are involved in every stage of the process. A lot of legal research and writing, of course, and a lot of work being spent determining which cases should be reviewed. So we are a court of discretionary review for the most part. And the process of sifting through the hundreds of petitions that come in every month is a very involved one, because we want to choose carefully. Most of the time we're looking for cases where the law is unstable throughout California, where there have been different intermediate courts of appeal that have reached different decisions on a common question of law, where the state high court is needed to step in to just make the law uniform throughout the state. And then also cases of exceptional public significance, I think, also get our attention. But I want to go back and underscore one thing that Judge Halligan said, and combine it with what Justice Long just said as well. I think that the diversity of issues that we see is something that's really unique. I mean, one thing that law students will remember from first year civil procedure, I hope, is that federal courts, of course, are courts of limited jurisdiction, which means that they don't have jurisdiction unless the Constitution or federal statute gives them jurisdiction. State courts are the opposite, which is that we have general jurisdiction, which is a presumption of jurisdiction unless the state constitution or statutes say that we don't have it, right? So the presumption is flipped. And what that means is that we hear cases from every area of the law, and many of those are very close to, retail concerns that people have. I'm sorry, I think it was Justice Hart who mentioned this. The administration of the courts is also sort of the administration of everyday disputes that people have. And here I'm thinking family law, juvenile law, criminal law, a lot of labor law, labor and employment law is state law, because it emanates from the reserved police power that the states have over things like the health and welfare, of workplaces and the public. So just, pound for pound or page for page, there's just a whole lot of state law out there on things that touch and concern people's everyday lives. And that's a very, very textured feature, I think, of a state law practice. Last thing I'll say is that we have one area specific in California which is not discretionary, which is the death penalty. So California continues to have a death penalty, even though the present governor has put a moratorium on the use of executions. And we have several hundred inmates who have death judgments. And those appeals directly from their judgments in trial court come to us without any intermediate court review. So we have a very sizable death penalty appeal docket, and those are direct appeals. And that also occupies a great deal of our time. And so clerks who clerk at this court will get inevitably a significant exposure to capital litigation.
Thank you.
And if I could just chime in, I also echo what my colleagues have all said. And I think one of the things, sort of the takeaway line, is that state courts are where justice happens. I mean, we hear more than 95%, I think it's 95 to 98% of all disputes, they happen in state courts. And I think that they are the everyday matters that folks we don't necessarily see in our course books in law school, but they are really what it means to practice law, is to take a problem from an everyday person. And in that sense, I think that clerking on a state trial court or a state Supreme Court is really in some ways a throwback to reading the law the way that, you know, the founding fathers, many of them did. And so this idea of being able to see at an appellate level, soup to nuts, what all of the pleadings were, and understanding what is good advocacy, what's not so good, I think is a real benefit and a real context to everyday problems. I'd also just like to pick up also on what Justice Hart said about access to justice. I think that that is the critical issue in state courts, and I'm not certain that that the federal courts have the same exposure to some of the difficulties presented by access to justice the way that we see them in state courts. And I think what's born of that is a lot of creativity in terms of problem solving. You know, here in the Rhode Island Supreme Court, we actually allow self-represented litigants to argue before us, and monthly. We also, like Judge Halligan, sit once a month, and we often have self-represented litigants appearing before us. And I think because the need is so great and so obvious, it forces us to try to think creatively. And the work that my clerks are also doing on that administration of justice side is very important and impactful work for law clerks.
So sticking with you for a second, Justice Long, given the importance and the breadth of this work, what do you look for in your clerks, and how can potential applicants stand out?
Thank you. I mean, I think we probably all have similar requirements in our job postings involving, you know, your transcript and maybe one or two writing samples that haven't been heavily edited. And many of us probably look for law review or law journal experience. So I don't necessarily think that those are the things that are surprising. It's tough to go through all of the applications. And so I often look really closely at cover letters to see what comes through in terms of your personality about why you want to be in a state Supreme Court, and also why you want to be in the Rhode Island Supreme Court. You know, we don't have the beautiful mountains of Colorado. We don't have the excitement of New York City. We don't have what all that California has to offer. But we're small but mighty, and we have a deep sense of community here, and a real connection to, and sometimes complicated connection to, history. And I think that one of the things that is important for me when I see, and many of my law clerks have come from out of state, is a desire to come to Rhode Island and be part of the community while they're here, and perhaps stay and contribute and make an impact in Rhode Island or elsewhere.
Does anyone else want to add to that?
I would just add, you know, I think that it's helpful, very much of what you just heard. I would absolutely agree with. I think it's also helpful to be able to explain why you want to clerk in a state court and why you want to clerk in a particular state court, as opposed to just sort of an undifferentiated sense that maybe I should do a clerkship somewhere. I also look for folks who seem to me to be able to bring an open mind to a case. We all come to any question, I think, with a set of life experiences, but to really be able to think closely and with a receptive mind about both sides of an argument. And finally, I really am looking for folks who think that they want to spend the hours reading and writing, because that is a lot of the work. It is, I think, in some respects, a little bit solitary. I think that they collaborate a lot, both within chambers and with clerks in other chambers. But that's part of what I'm looking for, is a sense that you'll be happy spending your year doing this work.
I
Yeah,
absolutely
I would
agree.
just, sorry, go ahead, Justice Hart.
No, you go ahead. Sorry, Goodwin. I mean, Justice Liu, whatever.
That's all right.
Sorry.
I'll just add that I think one interesting feature of our court is that it's a very collaborative court. So we're a 7-member court, and there is definitely a sense that the justices in our chambers are trying to work as an institution rather than as just 7, individual law firms. So there is that. I think that's really nice, actually, because people have a sense of sort of allegiance to the institution. Hopefully, we can try to speak in unison whenever possible. In fact, our unanimity rates in our court are above 80%, which is, some people find incredible. But I think I really credit that to some of the internal norms and processes that we have in our court that drive people towards agreement and accommodation whenever possible. One feature of that, though, is that there's a lot of exchange that happens at the law clerk level among chambers. And so folks that I'm looking for on my team are people who are good at working well with others. That sort of ineffable quality that you begin learning in kindergarten actually turns out to be incredibly important in working life. So it doesn't matter how brilliant you are, it doesn't matter how great a writer you are. You will need to be able to, work well with others, listen carefully to other people's concerns, learn how to disagree respectfully, and figure out ways of being persuasive that, are not simply, relying on the sheer brilliance of your arguments, which we know only take people so far. So I think of this experience as a kind of great learning experience for how to work well in group settings and to do what lawyers do, which is to, begin learning and mastering the art of persuasion, which you realize is not just a kind of single dimensionality of skills. And I think that's really important.
If I can follow on that, in our court, like California's, is a 7-member court, and we really like each other. I've been on 3 courts since I joined the court, and I think the other judges will understand what I mean. Each time a new member joins the court, it becomes a different court. And this court that I'm on right now, it's so great. It's so great. We just really like each other, and we disagree with each other, but we disagree so well. It's really wonderful. And our clerks really like each other, and we have a bunch of clerk traditions. They have breakfast every Friday morning. They do this trivia thing every Friday. We are all on the 4th floor of the Ralph Card Judicial Center at the court, and they're just friends. Like last year, I think there were 6 or 7 of them that had a running club together. I don't know what they're all doing this year, skiing or I don't know, but they, something more athletic than I do. But they're friends. They like each other and they talk to each other, and it's. I think it would be fun. I have to say to all of you students who are listening, clerking is fun. It really is. It's fun because it's intellectually engaging, but it's fun also just because it's fun, because you get to be with nice, interesting people who do trivia and go running and are fun and have breakfast. And like my law clerks, one of my law clerks bakes bread almost every day, and they're just great. They're just really great people. So I think that's worth knowing about clerking. It's just also a great fun job. So someone asked in like the chatty thing about letters of recommendation and what we wanted to hear from letters of recommendation, and I just one of my current colleagues before I had joined the court, he said, when I was still a law professor, he said, I think the best thing that a letter of recommendation can do is to talk about the soft skills. And I thought that was like such incredibly important advice, because it's really, really hard. Your resume isn't going to talk about the soft skills. Your transcript isn't going to talk about the soft skills. But a letter of recommendation from a professor or from an employer can talk about the soft skills. And if it doesn't, it's not doing any work. If it just says they got an A, it's not doing any work, because your transcript already does that work. So I would say the most important work that a letter of recommendation can do is it can talk about how you are as a person, how you interact with other people. That's really, to me, those are the best letters of recommendation. And I'm curious if other people agree, but to me, those are the best.
So we are getting already some audience questions in the chat, but I'm going to ask those at the end. So you all don't have to yet start. I mean, you're perfectly welcome to, because law students, I think, are eager to hear anything that you have to say. I just don't feel pressure right now to read what's coming through the chat, because I'm going to ask them at the end. So Judge Halligan, I saw you unmute. Did you have something that you wanted to add?
I was just going to pick up on a couple of the comments that Justice Liu and Justice Hart just made, because they really resonate for me. You know, I think it's exactly right that myself anyway, but it sounds like my colleagues too, are looking for, and I think one of the skills that you can hone while clerking is learning to collaborate. That is, I think, essential, and something that almost all of us end up doing, you know, throughout our professional lives. But also, I think, to learn to disagree, not just with respect, but with rigor, right? So telling someone that their view is wrong, or whatever adjective you want to use, is not so helpful as telling them why you think it's wrong, and being able and interested in a back and forth, and in a back and forth that sometimes changes your mind. And so I think that having the opportunity to do that exercise around issues that are interesting, that matter, not just to the parties in front of us, but to litigants across the state, I think that's a really valuable experience. And, you know, gosh, what Justice Hart says about friendships, I think, is exactly right. I had the chance to clerk when I finished law school for a couple of years, and some of my closest friends are still the folks I clerked with. And I really hope the same for my clerks as well. And that certainly seems to be the kind of camaraderie that they have. So I think that's a huge asset.
You all are really solidifying my regret at not clerking on a state Supreme Court. So I'm just going to ask one more question before we move over to Grace and then turn to audience questions. So some of you have been on the bench for long enough to have seen your former clerks go on and have, flourishing careers. Can you give some examples of some of the things that your former clerks are doing, and tell us how did clerking with you or on your court prepare them for those things? And this is for anybody who feels moved.
Yeah, I'll start if that's all right. So I've been on the Supreme Court for a little more than 4 years. So I've had a small batch of clerks who've gone on, and they've done any number of things, actually. And I'm quite proud of them. I have 3 kids of my own, but I feel like I have this growing family of law clerks as well. Some of them have gone on to clerk in our federal district court here in Rhode Island, or to the First Circuit. Some have gone on to big law, some have gone to boutique firms. And so really, I think it runs the gamut. I also feel like I have to say that several of our state court judges and 2 of our 3 district court judges, federal district court judges, all clerked for the Rhode Island Supreme Court earlier in their careers. And our junior senator from Rhode Island clerked on the West Virginia Supreme Court. So I really think that clerking on a Supreme Court, whether it's in Rhode Island or wherever, is really a great accelerant and starter for a career.
Yeah, I've been on the court now. This is my 14th year, so I guess that makes me old. And I'm old enough to see my law clerks do quite a few things. Several of them have become professors. Several of them have become law firm partners. I've got, clerks all over the place in public interest nonprofits of various sorts. A couple of them have exited law and have done innovative entrepreneurial things, startups, et cetera. But what I like the most, I would say, is that there's a broad diversity of things that they've done. The clerks that I've had are not terribly cookie cutter in terms of what they end up doing. And I think that's great because it is emblematic of the broad range of, that the clerkship is a departure point for a broad range of interests, and the skills learned here are applicable across a very wide range of practices, as well as even just involvements in career life and beyond career life. So I think that's in part testament to the general qualities that you learn through an experience like this, as well as maybe some selection criteria that I use in terms of just the wide range of people that I'm interested in.
Thank you all so much. So before we turn to the audience questions, we're going to bring Grace Spulak in, and she's from the National Center for State Courts, and she's going to talk a little bit about a resource that they developed for students who are seeking state court clerkships.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. The National Center for State Courts is a nonprofit that works closely with state courts in all of our U.S. states and territories to drive innovation and support the administration of justice. And so because of this, we know how important the work of state courts is and how important these clerkship positions are to support state courts, help people learn about the law, how state courts work, and build professional networks. Because each of these state courts post their own clerkship positions, traditionally there was not a centralized place where interested applicants could go and find positions and apply for these positions. And so the National Center has worked with some state court leadership organizations like the Conference of Chief Justice and the Conference of State Court Administrators to launch Cora. If you could put up the Cora slide, please. So Cora is a free online portal where courts can upload clerkship opportunities and applicants can go and submit applications for these opportunities through the platform. We envision Cora as being an equivalent to the Oscar platform on the federal court side, where we have a central repository of state court clerkship positions. We have a common application that folks can use to upload their applications, and those are sent directly to the courts. You can check out the Cora platform using this QR code, or you can go to ncsc.org/Cora. Right now, we have about 100 opportunities that are currently open in Cora. Since our pilot phase launched in 2025, we've had over 400 clerkship positions posted in Cora. We've had over 500 applicants submit their applications through Cora. So we really encourage you to use Cora, to go there to search for opportunities across the country. We've had over 40 states and territories post opportunities in Cora, and we hope this is a really useful resource for all of you as you're searching for clerkships and applying for these positions. We are in the process of launching a rebuild of the platform as well, based on feedback we've gotten in this pilot phase. So we're hoping that Cora will be a robust resource for state courts and potential clerks for years and years to come.
Thank you so much, Grace. That was great. All right, so I'm going to turn now to a few audience questions that we've gotten, both in the chat and that were submitted in advance. So do any of you have advice for somebody who is who's been out of law school for longer, 5+ years? Do you hire attorneys with more experience who want to clerk, or do you strictly limit the positions to recent graduates? Go ahead, Justice Hart.
I hire more experienced attorneys. So 5 years is an interesting number. I tend to hire 2 clerks who are straight out of law school and one attorney who is not straight out of law school. I don't think I've had someone 5 years out, but I always try to have someone at least 2 years out, and I certainly wouldn't foreclose someone 5 years out. I like having someone with experience. I think it's really valuable to have someone with experience.
Okay, and what about sort of a related question that we got are people who are in law school now, but as a career change, so they had a whole different career before this. Do you have any advice for folks like that, or do you just?
I love it. I don't know what other people think, but I love it. I think it's great. I have a daughter right now who's just graduating from college, and she's applying to law school, and I've been saying to her, no, take time off, do something else. I think doing something else between college and law school is a great thing to do. So
yeah, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was just going to jump in and say I went straight from undergrad to law school, and it worked out fine for me. But I have literally told any college student who's asked me, probably since I went to law school, to take time off. I think that it makes you a better lawyer, a better learner. You have context for what it is that you're learning in law school. And as a consequence, I generally prefer law clerks who have some experience either in between law school, undergraduate and law school, or even beyond. And I currently actually also have an intern who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and his greatest accomplishment is better than any I'll ever have, and that is that he brought all of his troops home alive. So I love people with experience.
I think that's right. Last year, I had a clerk who worked as a journalist for a number of years before going to law school. This year, I have a clerk who served as a naval officer on a Navy nuclear sub. She did that for 8 years, and I think that their work and their perspective really benefits from that time.
Thank you.
Also, my daughter will be fabulous, just to be clear, but still.
Justice Liu, did you want to add anything? No, I think we might be having technical issues. He might be frozen. All right. So do you have any advice for candidates who are not from your state? How can they, maybe they have minimal connections to your state. Is there anything that they can do to make up for that? Does it matter? So on.
Again, I'll jump in and say most of my law clerks have come from out of state, and I really do look for people who are interested in Rhode Island. I think, and showing that in some way in their cover letter or when they're interviewing, that Rhode Island is someplace where they either want to see themselves making an impact or using it to be able to go back to their home state. I have one who's in California, one who went to Virginia, several who've gone to Massachusetts, and taking what they've learned here and scaling it for where they are. So just show that you're interested in Rhode Island. It's a great place to live.
I think that's right. I think it's important to show some interest in. I mean, gosh, I have to say we're from 4 very cool states, so I feel like and anyone who can't show why they're interested in New York, Colorado, Rhode Island, or California is lacking imagination. That just seems like something you would be able to do. And I think, and you need to do that in a cover letter. You need to say why this makes sense to you.
Thank you. I wanted to say hi, welcome back, Justice Liu.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Are state Supreme Court clerkships an option for foreign students or foreign trained attorneys? I know that they cannot access federal clerkships to the same extent as law students who are U.S. citizens.
I'll say that here in California, the answer is yes. I've hired two, over 14 years, I guess, I've hired two non-citizen law clerks, both of whom were absolutely fabulous, and they've gone on to tremendous careers in private practice. So we don't have the same restrictions that exist for federal clerkships. So it's a good option to explore for those who are ineligible actually to clerk in the federal courts.
Thank you. Do you have any advice for clerks in the early part of their clerkship who are nervous that they're going to make a mistake? Do you recognize that there's a learning curve? And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're gonna make a mistake. That's gonna happen, and you know what? That's okay. Like I mean, I think we all. I'll speak for myself. I made a bunch of mistakes in the early part of every single job I've ever had. I think that's just part of life, and I just think that's part of life. And you own it and learn from it and grow. And that's what you do. That's what I think, at least.
I think that's right. I've only been doing this for 2 years, but I told my clerks a story. I clerked for a judge who was a wonderful mentor to me and became a good friend. She was very demanding. And the first bench memo I worked on for her, this was on a federal circuit court, was a criminal case. And I had not appreciated that the court generally will focus only on the issues actually raised in the appeal. So I wrote a very extensive bench memo where I addressed not only the issues raised by defense counsel, but every other possible issue I might identify through the entire trial transcript. Well, I soon realized that that was really not the way to proceed when she came back and she stuck her head in my cubicle and she said, if the parties don't brief an issue unless it's really egregious, you probably don't have to discuss it at such length. And I appreciate much more now how completely clueless that must have made me look in her eyes, but she was very gracious about it. And so I have told my law clerks that story when they started with an eye towards, there is a learning curve and that's okay. And we'll get through that.
Yeah, if I could just add, I think that the bigger expectation is that you recognize you're going to make mistakes and then you go and you have a solution, right? I mean, I think that part of it is it's tough to go into a judge and say, I don't understand something, but I would much rather that you do that because time is a precious resource. And so the more time a law clerk is floundering, the less time they're actually getting to the right or the best answer, and the stress of that and all of that is just not worth it. And so I expect that folks don't know what they don't know, but come to me and talk to me.
That was all great advice for any job, I think. So thank you. Previously, Justice Hart started answering the question, or did answer the question about what you look for in cover letters. I just wanted to check if anybody else had anything to add to that.
I would just amplify what she said. I agree entirely that the cover letter is an opportunity. It's actually a wasted opportunity if you submit just a form cover letter with no particular personal information, just says, I'm interested in clerking, here are my recommenders, thank you very much. I think that's a wasted opportunity. You should take the opportunity to write a substantive cover letter with 2 or 3 paragraphs that is the first impression, in fact, that you make to your audience. And it's an opportunity to say something personal about yourself, a little bit about your background, why you want to clerk for that court, in that jurisdiction, for that chambers, for that judge. And it's also a chance to show that you did a little research to sift through your options and have carefully considered your decision as to why you're applying in this particular place. So I would say, make the most of it and make it count positively for your application.
If a student isn't in the top of their class or doesn't have any moot court experience, is there any other experience that could make up for that?
So I would say that one of the things that is, I think, beneficial is if you have had experience in a state trial court, and I did see a question earlier about a state trial court. I think part of this is really understanding the system, understanding, I laugh, the federal court here in Rhode Island is wonderful. It's right across the street. But whenever I go over there, you could hear a pin drop walking into the vestibule. And state courts are busy. There is so much going on. And I think to the extent that you can have clinical experience or other experience that shows that you appreciate what our system is about and the rule of law and democracy and why it matters for the many, many, many people who come through the door, that they're looking for due process and a real curiosity and curiosity about how that plays out and an understanding of why that's important, I think can make up for other deficits. You have to be an interested and strong researcher and writer. Maybe you're not at the top of your class, but you have got to be a strong researcher and writer and able to, I think, as all of my co-panelists said earlier, work with others. So those are, I think you can highlight those strengths, even if you're not in the top of your class.
Thank you.
And I totally, if I can, I totally agree with Justice Long. And actually, when I'm first reviewing applications, I don't look at transcripts. I ask my law clerks to put together a spreadsheet that has the connection to Colorado, public interest focus, legal writing grade. That's the only grade I actually want to see is grades in legal writing classes, whether it's 1L legal writing or upper level legal writing, because I'm suspicious of law school grades other than that, frankly. And that's what I want to look at. And that's where I start. If someone is a strong legal writer, if it turns out they don't do well on timed 3-hour exams, life is not a timed 3-hour exam. But if they can do well at legal writing, that's what ends up mattering the most, I think. That's what I need is someone who can do legal writing, and that's what I'm going to need for them, not a good 3-hour tort exam. So.
I love that, because some of the most brilliant attorneys I know did not get great grades. So I agree. It's not always the best predictor. The question that Justice Long was referencing that came through the chat, I'm going to ask it, even though we're like really running low on time. So let's be very, very quick about this one. Was that somebody asked, I'm spending a year working as a judicial clerk in a state trial court. What advice do you have to help me secure a subsequent clerkship at the state Supreme Court level? Would anybody like to take that one? And then we're going to move on to our wrap up.
I'd say just real quick that probably one of the most valuable things you could do is to do legal writing. At the trial level, I imagine you're very busy making quick decisions every day. There's probably 50 decisions that a trial judge has to make every single day. At the appellate level, it's a much slower deliberative process. We, as is often said, sometimes with a wry expression, we take 6 months, or longer to make a decision that a trial judge has to make in 6 minutes, right? So, but what that means is that the skill set is slightly different. The long deliberative process that we have puts a high premium on research and writing, which may not be, it's not an exclusive thing, but it just may not be as prominent in trial court experience. And so just make sure that you have an opportunity, whether it's summary judgment motions, motions to dismiss, or something that requires more sort of legal analysis and sustained attention in the form of a written memo.
Thank you so much. So now we're just going to move on to our summary question. So from everybody, I'll just go across my screen. What is one thing that you want the audience to walk away with? And we'll start with Judge Halligan.
I would say the docket, as I think you've heard from all of us today, that each of our court hears, it's incredibly diverse. It really matters to pretty much every person that lives in our state. And I think that it is a tremendous way to start to prepare yourself for a legal career.
Thank you. I'll move next to Justice Hart.
I'm going to leave you with this. It's fun. It's a lot of fun, a lot of interesting questions, a lot of collaboration. It's a fun job. You should apply to us.
Great. Justice Liu?
Well, my takeaway is that I wish I were Justice Hart's law clerk. I think it does sound like a lot of fun, the way she describes it. And I think actually on a more serious level, it's wonderful that the Brennan Center has convened this group because although I know all three of the other panelists from other involvements and encounters, it's really fun actually to listen to the experiences that they've had with their clerks. And this is part of the disseminating of the knowledge, right? So I do a lot of teaching, and I'm sure that, my colleagues also either teach or come across lots of law students. And it's nice to be able to advise them, to all the different opportunities out there. So to people who are looking for opportunities, if you search far and wide and you listen carefully to programs like this, take lots of notes, you will zero in on many additional opportunities that perhaps your law school advising offices haven't focused on.
And finally, Justice Long.
Yeah, I'll end where you started, Kasia, and that is that the state Supreme Courts do issue opinions that can have national impact. And you talked about Baker versus the state of Vermont and Goodridge versus Department of Public Health in Massachusetts. I would go back even further and talk about Trevitt versus Whedon, which was an argument in Newport courts in 1786 that influenced the decisions in Marbury versus Madison. The state Supreme Courts, state Supreme Courts have real import for individual people and also eventually often for the entire country. And they are great places to work. And I know that, as I said, California, New York, and Colorado have so much to offer, but the Ocean State's awesome. So I hope that you'll also consider us.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for your time and your wisdom. This was a really interesting conversation, and I hope it was helpful to all of the students out there. Thank you to the audience for the questions. I wish we had time to answer them all. The Brennan Center and the State Court Report hope that you come to future events. So please sign up for State Court Report's newsletter at statecourtreport.org to hear about upcoming events and just to learn everything that there is to know about state courts and state constitutions. Thank you all for coming.